Hey guys, welcome back. I am Bree if you are new here. So today I want to discuss raised beds versus in-ground gardening. I want to share the pros and cons of both to help you decide what may work best for your garden. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off with raised beds and begin with the pros. So number one, it is simply more accessible. Whether you are planting, weeding, harvesting, you name it, any of those garden activities, it is simply easier on your body. It's not as strenuous simply because it is lifted off the ground. You're not doing as much bending over. Simple as that. So number two, you choose the soil. You can start off having great soil from the very beginning. We'll discuss this a little bit further in the in-ground portion simply because in-ground might not be for everyone. So keep that in mind. But with raised beds, you simply get to choose the soil and there's a lot of power in that. Number three, better drainage and better roots. The roots can actually tap in a lot further down, creating a better plant. Also, that soil isn't as densely compact, letting water to run through it a little bit easier, but there are some cons to that as well that we will discuss in just a second. Number four, less weeding, which is always a plus, especially when you have a garden as big as mine. So number five, it actually prevents your soil from eroding and compacting. There will be some compacting throughout the years, but you can simply just add a little bit more soil on top of that and you're easy to go. It's not being walked on, so that soil is a lot fluffier, and again, allowing it to have better drainage and better roots. Number six, it's easier to keep pests and pets out, which this is not foolproof. It does keep my English bulldog out, but squirrels and birds, they're a little bit trickier. It has gotten better now that I've covered the beds. They're not digging through the beds. I had that problem last year. But that is something that you want to bite in the butt at the very beginning of the season. If you see it, they will destroy your little seedlings, and this is more prone to happening in ground because you're also worrying about bunnies and even more birds at that point because they do tend to eat on the ground, so keep that in mind. Last but not least, for the pros, we have number seven, which it's easier to amend your soil. You're not going to be dealing with any type of runoff or anything you don't want in your soil that could also be affecting your soil. There's a lot that goes into that, but let's go ahead and move on to the cons of raised beds. Number one con, it takes money and material. I will say I have found some cheaper options through the years, but if you want to do organic gardening especially, you want to stay away from any type of second used wood or treated wood, which tends to be the cheaper wood. My wood beds that I have in my garden cost me, I think, about $200 each because we used untreated cedar. Whenever we leave this property, that wood will be coming with us and we will be rebuilding those beds unless for some reason the buyer would want that. There are cheaper options out there, and I have a few that I really like that I have throughout my garden that I will link in the description box below for you guys. But again, it takes some capital to do this. I have been adding little bits every year. I added, 3 garden beds last year. I added a garden bed the year before that, and I've slowly just kept expanding because it can be expensive, especially when you're doing a lot of raised bed gardening. Number two con, you have to water more often, which this kind of goes back to my pro number three, which was better drainage and better roots. Sometimes there's a give and take. Honestly, last summer I had more garden beds than ever. Our water bill was quite a bit more expensive. I have thought about adding some rain catching systems, but again, this is not our forever home. So we'll see. I would like to do that, but again, that's capital, that's money. All goes into it. Gardening can be an expensive hobby, but again, just know if you are doing raised beds, you're probably going to have a higher water bill than if you were to just do it in the ground. Number three, cost of soil. So every year, me and my husband have gotten a truckload of compost dumped that have cost us about $300, I believe, every year. There are some great benefits to that. We know it's very rich, awesome soil. We tend to have extra to where I can top off the beds throughout the summer, and that's also the cheapest option to fill your raised beds, to be completely honest. So just know that if you have raised beds, soil can be quite expensive to fill those beds, so keep that in mind. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the benefits of in-ground gardening. So number one on that list is startup cost is pretty low. You're not dealing with the materials, you're not getting soil trucked in, you're using pretty much your land and your land only, minus probably a handful of things. You probably need a tiller if you don't have one, you could probably rent one, but your startup cost is going to be a lot cheaper. The second pro I have on this list is less watering, which you may remember me discussing you'd have to water more. With raised beds, it's kind of the opposite when it comes to in-ground. This was actually something I witnessed last year when I incorporated in-ground gardening to my garden, and I was actually kind of amazed. I actually thought it was going to be the opposite of that, but it wasn't. So there's a lot of geeky scientific stuff when it comes to all of that, but just know if you're doing an in-ground space, and you can do an in-ground space, you may have to actually water less. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump onto the cons, and number one on that list for me is more weeds. This was something I had a hell of a time with last summer, let me tell you. There is still weeds in that garden that I need to go ahead and pull out while it's still winter. But one thing is, if you're able to tarp an area, kind of look that up, tarp an area for a whole month, it will kill anything below it. I decided last minute last year that we needed to expand the garden even further, and we didn't have time to tarp. We tilled that area like 4 or 5 separate times, and the weeds have been a monster pain. They should be a lot better this next year, but no, if you are starting a in-ground area and it's your first year especially, you're probably going to be dealing with a lot of weeds. Your second year, again, will probably be a little less than that, but any in-ground space, you're going to be dealing with a lot more weeds unless you do any type of tarping or any type of landscape fabric. All right, so number 2 on this list is less drainage that can lead to flooding. So remember when I just said in the pros that it could be beneficial for less watering? Well, it can actually be the opposite if you get too much rain. If you do not have good drainage, you can honestly just probably say goodbye to whatever you planted in that area. If it's just sitting in water for a few days, it's not good. I actually experienced this, I think it was my first year gardening. We have a back fence, and along that back fence, I wanted to plant a ton of sunflowers. Well, planted those sunflowers, then we got a ton of rain. And in that area is where all the water for pretty much all the backyards of our neighborhood goes to flood, and it pretty much wiped out all of my flowers, which was very disappointing. So now I know I just honestly can't grow in that area, especially in ground. I could throw some planters over there, but again, keep that in mind. Less drainage can be a good and bad thing. It honestly depends on the plant and your weather, which you obviously can't control. Number 3 con is you may run into problems with the existing soil. You may live somewhere that's too sandy, too clay, too rocky, has too many roots. You can't control that. The area that I did in ground last year was kind of a pain with roots. I was taking an axe out there. We were really chopping some roots up. It was a lot of work, needless to say, but our soil over there is perfect without those roots. So if you can put in the labor and the soil is good, definitely do it. But if you are stuck with really sandy or really clay-like soil, you may just honestly not be able to plant in ground, so keep that in mind. Number 4 con, it's not as easy to amend the soil as it is with raised beds. So you are dealing with all sorts of different things when it comes to in-ground gardening. So one thing you do want to know with in-ground gardening is if your grass has been treated or if you've sprayed chemicals in your yard and there is any type of runoff, you are going to be getting those chemicals in your food. So if you have done that and you don't want to deal with anything that's foreign or not organic, raised beds will definitely be the way for you. If you haven't treated your yard and you know the yard has not been treated, definitely go ahead and rock the in-ground. Just also keep that in mind that can definitely play a role. And last but not least, for the cons of in-ground gardening, we have it's simply just not as comfortable. I firsthand experienced this last year when I was planting my in-ground space for the first time. I have gardened for years now, and again, this was my very first year doing an in-ground area. It was a lot harder to plant in the ground than it was my raised beds. It was not as comfortable. I had a yoga mat. My back really hurt after the fact. I felt like it took me a lot longer because I was constantly up and down, moving stuff. It just wasn't as efficient. I probably could have done better on my part, but it's not as comfortable. Personally, I love raised beds. I love the clean lines they bring to the garden. They bring a little bit of height. Again, it's so much more comfortable, but I also love my in-ground spaces for how cheap they have costed me. My 10 by 20 area, I think costed me like $150, $200, when one 8x4 garden bed costed me, I think $200. I have found some galvanized steel options that I will link down below that I have throughout my garden that I really do enjoy, and that's another option, but again, you cannot beat the cheapness of in-ground versus a raised bed. You honestly can't. But I hope this helped you guys out. If it did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Leave me a comment down below on which one is your favorite, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye!